you, Jamie, and thanks Glenn and the Raw Effect team for bringing us together to think about hope. What a great day that we have. And I think an understanding of hope and a response to it is all the more needed because of these times in which we are living. These times of great change, these times of emerging trends, these times in some sense of chaos. And I think all the more reason for us to understand the changes and to respond to them effectively. If I was to sum up this world, this era in which we're living, in which we need hope more than ever, with a single word, it would probably be that word change, because that's what defines this era, although probably not so much just that sort of change, but that sort of change, because the change is massive, and it's constant, and it's faster moving than ever before. And I think in the midst of such an environment, we can suffer change effect and change fatigue. We can start to worry about the changes. And I think as leaders and as influencers and as difference makers, we've got to not just be impacted by the change, but look at the change, understand the trends, respond to those shifts, create the future, and so have hope in it. And I think an understanding of the trends is key. We are living in the midst of the biggest decade of change, I think, in living memory. I mean, we're halfway through a decade that's going to take us through to 2020. And 2020 has always been that iconic year of the future, and we're going to be there within 5 years. I mean, to think about how quickly times change, think about 5 years ago, 2010. As 2010 emerged, we had the unemployment rate at 6.1%. Now it was 5.1% then. Now it's at 6.2%. On its way to 6.5% is the forecast. Uncertain times economically. Just in 5 years. Back then, the Aussie dollar had just hit parity with the US dollar for the first time since it was floated, since 1983 in 2010. And now it's down to 78 cents. Uncertain times economically. Demographically, we've grown. We just hit 22 million people back then in 2010. Today, we're going to finish this year at 24 million people nationally. That's an extra 2 million people in Australia. We're growing demographically. We're changing in that regard. Think about even generationally, the big shifts. We had Generation X and Y, but since then, Generation Z have moved from their teens into their 20s. We've got Generation Alpha. A whole new generation has been born since then. As 2010 emerged, we didn't even have the iPad. If you were talking tablets back in 2010, people thought you meant those sorts of things. So I'll try to get my little device here working. The technological trends, the smartphones, the apps that have emerged just in a short period of time in the span of half a decade, of course, has been phenomenal. And so we've emerged in terms of social media and communication channels in less than half a decade. And in half a decade's time, we will have hit 2020. Well, the PowerPoint doesn't seem to be working, but I'll push on. You know, it's, there, we're working now. So tablets don't mean that anymore. They now mean that, of course. And, in 2010, if you were talking, even some of the social media terms we use now, like tweets, people thought you meant the noise from those sorts of things. And now, of course, tweets, 500 million of them delivered every day on that sort of device. Massive change. It's only occasionally in history that you get massive demographic shifts combining with huge social change and ongoing generational transitions and technology trends. And the confluence of these trends is such that within the span of half a decade or a decade, society altogether alters, and that's where we're at. So I wanted to have a look at a lay of the land so we can not just be impacted by the trends, but drive some of those changes, not be intimidated by the shifts, but have hope in the future by understanding some sense of the change. And the first area we would look at would be some demographic change. What's happening in Australia? Well, we're growing. I mean, this is an amazing thing, and I think a very positive thing. We're the fastest growing nation in the developed world right now, growing at 1.6% per annum. But we're not only growing, we're also changing in terms of the mix and the makeup. We're more culturally diverse than we've ever been before. If we look at how we're growing, we've definitely got records in terms of births at the moment, and we're living longer, so the births minus the deaths is greater than ever. But 3/5 of our growth, the greatest proportion of our growth, is coming through net overseas migration. If you go back to the mid-1980s and look at the main countries of which Australians born overseas had come from, They were mainly European countries. We had New Zealand and then 4 European countries, whereas today you've got China and India in the top 5 countries. You've got Vietnam and Philippines. We're more connected to our part of the world now in terms of Asia, in this Asian century, our population, our connections, our diversity, and I think the global impact Australia has through these connections is greater than ever before. We used to think of ourselves as down under and isolated, but now we're difference makers in the region and I think on the international stage as well. The global trends are phenomenal. I mean, have a think about how quickly global trends travel the world these days, and particularly through technology. The very first online global meme, as they're called, that went viral took place in 2010, just at the start of social. You might remember the term back in 2010, photobombing. It was the first of these viral fads that went around the world, and all began with this squirrel that jumped in the way of the auto timer. Back before the selfie, back before the smartphone, you had to set up the timer on the shot and the squirrel jumped in the way. And people thought that was really cool. They started this concept of photobombing. People then started looking through their holiday photos, looking for things they had never noticed before, and they put those online. This whole thing just went viral in a very short period of time. You might remember we quickly got over that, and by the time we got to 2011, the meme of the year was planking. You remember that? It seems like a lifetime ago. It was only 4 years ago. That is the speed of change. People would lie like a plank and get a photo taken. It's old news now. But I was trying to work out how it began. I mean, how did someone even come up with the idea of planking? And my current theory is that it was an accident. It was something that happened, and people thought, that's a cool thing. I'm going to go with that, and the whole thing took off and went global. You might remember back to 2012, the good old Gangnam Style. More than 2 billion views of that video. Almost 1 in 3 people on the face of the planet have watched that Gangnam Style video. That is the global connectivity and the speed of take-up through the viral connections of the social media today. By the time we got to 2013, you might remember the Harlem Shake. Last year, meme of the year was the Ice Bucket Challenge. And so the timeframes have accelerated, the connectivity has increased, the global nature of things is just mainstream today. And through our diversity, we see that even more. We're growing and we're changing. We're also, as a population, aging. And this is often couched as though it's a bad thing. Now, we look at our population profile of 3 decades ago, and we had more younger people and fewer older people. We look at it today, and we see the something going wrong here. You see the growth, if we look at the pyramid in terms of how it's changed from how it was 3 decades ago to how it'll be in 3 decades' time, and it's not a population pyramid anymore. It's lost that shape. It's become rectangular. It's just a sign that people are living longer than ever before. It's not a negative thing at all. The aging population simply means that the longevity is greater than ever. So the younger people here will be the generation that will live longer than any previous generation in history. If we go back 3 decades and look at average longevity at birth, it took people to the mid-70s. Today, life expectancy at birth takes people to the early 80s, and in 3 decades' time, at birth, life expectancy will take people to the mid-90s. Already, for those living today in their middle years, they can expect on average to live into their 90s. This is the modern realities of longevity, and it's an amazing opportunity. People are younger longer and active later and can work longer, and massive transformations in our time. So the changing and the growing and the aging that sometimes we think is negative is an amazing positive, and that's just the demographics. You know, we're changing from a social perspective, how we live and where we live. Massive changes in that regard as well. We've seen changes to the life stages. You know, it used to be childhood, teenagerhood and adulthood. But such is the education and the technology and the devices available today. We've got this up-aging. You've got the children, older, younger. They've got access to educational tools and resources and concepts and learning capacity in their hands. And so the emergence of what has been called the tween years, you know, childhood sort of ending earlier as the tweens emerge. And by the time someone moves from 19 to 20, they're not into the adult life stage either, because we've seen that be pushed back. Marriage and children and mortgage and career is being pushed back as people have the opportunity to study later in life and sometimes stay at home later in life as well with their parents. And so that's given emergence to the rise of the young adult life stage. Although sometimes the mid-20s become the late 20s or early 30s, and you've still got the young adults living at home, and that's where I think it's probably a stretch to call them young adults, but the term kippers sums up the reality pretty well. Kippers, that stands for kids in parents' pockets eroding retirement savings. So keep that in mind if you are some kippers, and I think we've got a few kippers in our midst, but that's okay. Because it's a sign of the new opportunities to be educated and to have the opportunity to move across multiple careers. Generation Z, those born since the mid-90s, that are going to be finishing school now and over the next few years, they will have more careers than ever before. They're averaging about 3 years per role, and that means, based on trends of working through the 60s, living longer, they will have 17 separate careers, 17 separate jobs or employers in their lifetime across 5 separate careers. The opportunity to retrain and upskill and transition more than we've ever seen before. They'll move geographically more than we have ever seen before. We're seeing, therefore, a generation have access to leadership at a younger age, be able to influence their organisations earlier, a change in how leadership and structures look from the hierarchical approaches of the 20th century, the authoritarian model, the command and control model, where everyone was in a chain of command and in their functional areas, to an environment now where businesses value work-life balance and flexibility. You've got flat structures and self-directed teams. You've got leadership right across an organisation, and you've got the ability to influence, and flatter structures where leadership is not just top-down. Amazing opportunities that have come through these new structures. Now, in this environment, we've got to make sure that we're all leaders, therefore. We're all influencers. We're all thinking entrepreneurially about how to innovate and change and adapt and shape things, not just waiting till we get that actual leadership role given to us. If we don't have the right leadership and self-directed outcomes in this time of change, where productivity and innovation is so required, we're going to end up with some substandard outcomes. You know, another meme doing the rounds online at the moment is called "You Only Had One Job" meme, and highlights what happens when there's not great self-directed motivation. You can end up with your tiling all messed up, and I'm not sure what went wrong on the production line, but people were putting the wrong items in the wrong packets, and that was a bit confusing. And as for the team that was putting safety messages on roads, I'm not sure what went wrong, but we need a new generation taking on new leadership and motivation and inspiration to lead and make a difference in their worlds from a younger age and in this time of great change. We're in a period not only of demographic change and social change, but of course generational change, and the baton is being passed from one generation to the next right now, and it provides a great opportunity for the new generations to lead in these times of great change. The baby boomers have dominated things for a long period of time, but now Gen X and Gen Y are moving into those ranks. Gen Z is starting employment. Gen Alpha are the children born since 2010. And I think these younger generations provide the opportunity to be a bridge between, in a sense, the 20th century traditional approaches and the 21st century new styles. To be a bridge between some of the younger generations and some of the older generations. In fact, I heard about a Generation Z fella who was finding a good solution for his grandparents. He had to go around to Grandma's house and reprogram her TV every few weeks because she was pushing too many buttons on the remote control. And finally, after I think the third or fourth visit, he found a good solution to the problem. It's just an innovative generation, and a bit of masking tape was all that was required, and she never had to mess around with the TV, and he never had to reprogram it. We're dealing now with a generation that are the world's first global generation. The technology, the employment opportunities, the education, the foods, the fashions, the music, it's truly gone global for this generation today. And digital in terms of the platforms and the channels and the apps that drive them, and from an influence perspective and a connection perspective, social, it's not just what the authority figures say, it's the influence of the peer groups, it's the empowerment, the democratization of influence these days through the social channels of today. Not only global and digital and social, but mobile in opportunity and lifestyle, and in terms of where they will study or work. It's never been a time of greater change than that, in terms of how information is consumed and created, and how we make decisions. It's not just the written forms of content, but the visual forms. It's interesting that the number one search engine for Generation Z is no longer Google, but it's YouTube. because we've got a generation that doesn't necessarily just want to read an article about something. They are influenced by watching a video on something, and that digital and visual literacy shapes their mindset today. We do have to be able to all bridge these gaps and speak the language of the next generation. In fact, Generation Z are pretty good at using the texting technologies of today, and with that has come a whole new language, slanguage we call it, such as the slang terms of today. And a sentence came my way from a Gen Z fellow recently. I thought I'd put it up to see how we would go deciphering that. For shiz, my work gig is totes cron. The hours are defs cray cray but YOLO. It's a pretty creative generation. There's some new words emerging all the time, and they're pretty efficient at shortening lots of those terms. Let me just test you on some of those, just keep things interactive. We've got a lot of Gen Zs I can see with this. What is for shiz? What does that mean? For sure. Excellent. And what is the work gig anyway? A job. Okay, fantastic. And totes means totally, and cron means chronic, and if things sound bad, I've learned that means it's good. So, like if it's fully sick, that's an excellent thing. So that's great. And defs means definitely, and cray, crazy, and YOLO. You only live once. That's a creative language we're dealing with this innovative generation. It's sometimes funny that it takes a little while to get to the point, because I've worked out that what this fellow was trying to say, and it's not as many words, I like my job. So that's the generation that we're dealing with today. And finally, in addition to the demographic trends and the social trends and the generational transitions, of course, we've got technological transformation. I mean, think about the array of platforms that have emerged in half a decade. And if that's what's happened in, the space of a few years, what is our life going to be like in 2020? By the time that this decade comes to an end, I think it's the opportunity to understand these trends, to shape these trends, and to not be fearful of the change, but to embrace so many of them. So if our social network, if our social tools of connecting with others are defined not so much by those sorts of apps and devices and platforms, but by that sort of thing, then maybe it's time for an upgrade. Because the Teledex was great, but it's probably served its time. We have, in just a few years, entered what we call the great screen age, where these screens have become ubiquitous. We spend more time on the screens and influenced by screens and connecting through screens than ever before. And sometimes the screens do something counterintuitive. For a while they were getting smaller, but I think this guy picked up on the trend of what's been happening. They've lately been getting larger for some strange reason. But this next generation, born since the start of this decade, we've called Generation Alpha, because they're not going back to the start of the alphabet, they're the start of something new in this whole new century and a whole new naming category. We've also said here that they are Generation Glass, because it's the glass, not the pen and paper, that is the educational tool and the communication tool and the medium on which they interact. It's glass that they carry in their pocket through the use of these phones. It's glass that they and we will increasingly wear on our wrist. It's interactive glass, it's touchscreen glass, it's glass that we'll not only carry and wear on our wrists but wear on our faces. It's glass that'll be on the heads-up display of the first car that Generation Alpha ever drive. This is the glass of today. And I was looking at what we're loading onto the glass. I looked up the most downloaded app on their glass. We have access to 1 million apps, all with one button on these devices. It's pretty phenomenal how it works. And last year in Australia, the most downloaded app, I was wondering, was it an educational tool or a productivity tool or a communication tool? But for Australians last year, the most downloaded app was Candy Crush. But I think there's hope, because I think we can do something better with the glass, and I think over time we will. Let me conclude with 4 words to help us navigate these times of change, and I think thrive amidst the chaos and the trends. I think embrace 2020 as it approaches, not with intimidation and fear, but with the confidence in terms of some sense of knowing where the trend lines are headed and knowing what the future holds. I think what these times of change require is, and I've summarised this using 4 R's. I know in education there used to be 3 R's, and 2 of them weren't even R's, so that never worked for me. But these are 4 genuine R's, all starting with R, and the first is we've got to keep it real. These times we've entered are times of transparency and authenticity, where people have the power to connect and communicate and engage, and the barriers in some senses have been removed, and that authenticity matters more than ever. It was Safety at Work Week recently, and there was an employer who was pretty keen to get his safety message out to his staff, but unfortunately, the message didn't quite match up with his approach. The walk didn't quite match the talk, and I think authenticity, keeping it real, matters so much these days. Secondly, we've got to keep it relevant, which means adjust and adapt what we do and how we do it to communicate in ways that make sense these days. Sometimes the old approaches don't work in this new time. Sometimes the 20th century structures don't apply in the 21st century era. There's been a safety message around waterways in the US for some time, and that's the sign they used to put up if you see someone drowning. Now, in the middle there, that's supposed to be a stick figure of someone with their arms raised saying, help, help, you know. But unfortunately, that's not how we read that these days. If you see someone drowning, LOL. Now, to lol, I mean, to laugh out loud, that's not the right response when someone is struggling out there in the water, of course. So it might have had relevance, it no longer does, it needs to be upgraded. We've got to keep it real, we've got to keep it relevant, and of course, we've got to keep things responsive, which means adjusting and adapting and changing. We wake up each day in this changing world and we have to innovate. We're in a non-stop quest for relevance. If we don't change, then the change force, which is like a centripetal force, will pull us to the margins of relevance. And so each day we struggle to find ways to innovate and create difference, to find ways of connecting in authentic and real and relevant ways. That means we've got to be responsive. This guy wasn't responsive to the terrain. His job was to drive the truck and paint the line and not stop and remove fallen tree branches. And we have to do better than that. We've got to respond to the realities of what we see around us, in our environment, in our times, in our context, respond to the change that we see. And finally, in addition to keeping it real and relevant and responsive, we have to keep it relational. You know, the technology actually will come and go. And we'll soon get rid of these smartphones, there'll be something new. The technology tools will continue to be transformed, but what will not change is what stands behind the technology, who holds the technology, us, and the need for that human interaction, that social connection, the trust and the values and the character, the relational foundation that is essential to our business and educational and all of those transactions that define our life. That authenticity of relationship matters and will not be outdated by technology. In fact, in some ways, it matters even more in this era of social media and social networking and social communication. I saw a guy, though, who was taking it a little bit too literally. Be the first of your friends to like this post. I think he didn't quite understand the whole point. But nonetheless, if we understand the changes, the trends and the shifts, we won't be impacted negatively by the changes. We won't suffer change fatigue. We'll have a confidence of where it's going. We'll be like the surfer who doesn't get pounded by the waves but positions the surfboard to surf the waves and thrive in the time of change. And I think if we can do that, we won't just survive, we will thrive, and I wish you all the best in it. And thanks for listening.